So to wrap up then about the Industrial Revolution, how revolutionary was it, right? By the end of the 19th century, you have places like this in the picture, where huge smokestacks pumped out coal dust, coal soot into the air. Because in these buildings, machines drove productivity. And people crowded up near them because they had to walk to work. And so factory towns grew wherever there were industrial plants. And it was revolutionary because it is a change from hand production to machine production. It is revolutionary because work didn't occur in the home, it occurred in a factory. It is a change from living in a rural environment for most people to living in an urban environment for most people. That urban life becomes the standard and rural life becomes the exception. That's flipping everything in human history on its head. Where urban life was exceptional, rural life was more common. It's a change from independence to dependence. The factory worker is dependent upon the wages coming from that factory. The factory worker is dependent on a market economy where they have to buy their food at market. They're dependent upon who's going to ever rent them a place to live. So if this factory worker loses his or her job, they're out of luck, right? They have no way to raise food. They have no way to make their own clothes. They have no path forward without this cash from their job. They're incredibly dependent upon that job for all of their survival. And the factory owners know this. And the factory owners exploit this. This is revolutionary. Well, what about the timing? Well, there is a technological change that happens where all the technology is in place basically by 1800, right? The steam engine is in place, the cotton gin's in place, the power loom's in place. All of those technological features we talked about earlier are completed around 1800 for textile production. But then what about things like transportation? Well, it takes really until 1840, 1850 before you get true locomotives, steamboats. Those things make it easier to move bulk product around countries, so that railroads and steamboats take over what had been either a coastal trade or a river trade. And that happens around mid-century. Timing also matters where you are. Well, it's happening in England in the 1830s, 1840s, happens in the United States around 1870, 1860, but it's not happening in China until the 20th century, not happening in Russia until the 20th century. So while the quote industrial technology, burst onto the scene around 1800, it takes a while to permeate throughout the world, and you can still look around the world and there are areas without industrialization. If you want to see this for yourself, there's a pretty good video on YouTube that films in San Francisco 1906. And it's entitled A Trip Down Market Street. And at about the 7-minute mark, you can fast forward and just look. Right? I would encourage you to just go look with your own eyes and compare the cityscape of San Francisco at the beginning of the 20th century, what you would imagine a city looking like today, right? If you watched a video about San Francisco or New York or London or Paris, and ask yourself how much of life in San Francisco, even in 1906, was traditional, right? Where people were doing things, they were walking themselves, they weren't relying on machines. And how much is what we would consider modern? How close were the people living their lives in 1900? Was it more like us or was it more traditional, right? There's lots of ways to measure and look at industrialization, but how much did it change daily life and when did it change daily life? For some people, daily life changed around 1800. Obviously, a few people, their lives changed. When we get to the 20th century, that's when the big changes, particularly in countries that adopt industrialization, that's when the big changes start happening in everyday life.